I'll start with Leila Aboulela, who sits here. And she is a winner of the Kane Prize for African Writing. She's the author of four novels, The Kindness of Enemies, Minaret, The Translator and Lyrics Alley. She grew up in Sudan, and now she lives in Aberdeen. Next to her, sitting on her left, is Joan Anim-Addo, who is the Professor of Caribbean Literature and Culture at Goldsmiths College, University of London. She has written more than I am able at this point to read out, but her publications include The Liberator, as well as, this looks like something I need to pick up myself, Sugar, Spices and Human Cargo, An Early Black History of Greenwich, and The Longest Journey, A History of Black Lewisham. Sitting at the end is Sareeta Domingo, who is a writer and editor from Southeast London. Her debut novel, The Nearness of You, will be published in May 2016. She has been commissioned to write several short stories and collections of erotic fiction for Agent Provocateur, and was also commissioned to write a novella in the genre for Pavilion Books. Sitting next to me is Robin Yassin-Kassab, who is the author of the novel The Road from Damascus. He has lived and worked in London, France, Pakistan, Turkey, Syria, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and he now lives in Scotland, which led me to calling him an immigrant, and he said, no, I am British born and bred, so he's more a migrant than an immigrant. He's co-author with Leila Al-Shami of the forthcoming book on the Syrian Revolution and war.
Not forthcoming, it's over
there. Okay, of the existing book of the Syrian Revolution, Belet, I blame Belet, and it's called Burning Country. His journalism on Syria has appeared in The Guardian, National, Al Jazeera, and Foreign Policy. My name is Radhika Swarup, and I'm a writer. I write fiction. My debut novel was released last week. It's called Where the River Parts, and it focuses on a couple caught in the India-Pakistan partition. Anyway, I will now pass you on to our individual panelists, and we will begin to discuss liberation, and we'll start with what liberation means to all of us individually. Now, liberation is a wonderful word, and I think it's one that's so porous, and it allows us to superimpose our prejudices and our experiences on it. When I was 17 years old, liberation for me meant leaving my parents' home and going to the pub and being able to drink. Since then, the meaning of the word has evolved for me. And it's tied up, I think, intrinsically in my experiences. I am a woman and I'm an Indian. So for me, liberation is really, really tied up strongly in the fact that India won her independence in 1947, and the kind of struggle for independence means something in the context of liberation. Also, as a woman, the struggle for equality, which in many parts of the world, and arguably even in the West is still ongoing, puts a definite spin on the word liberation for me. I will now pass you on to Leila, who has, I think, a very, very interesting spin on liberation she'd like to share with all of us.
Okay. I think when you asked us by email what we felt about the word liberation, I said that I felt that for me fiction was more liberating than nonfiction. So maybe I should explain more about that. I find that I've had bad experiences with nonfiction. I've only written 2 articles, one for the Washington Post and one for the Guardian, that people seem to accept it better somehow. And I don't know why, but somehow if I say something through fiction, I mean, like if I write, for example, let's say one of my novels, Minaret, was about a girl who is from Sudan, and she has a very westernized upbringing. And then she comes to London. She's exiled because of her, there's a coup in Sudan and so forth. And she kind of comes down in the world, and she starts to wear the hijab, and she starts to become more religious and to go to the mosque in Regent's Park. So this novel is okay, it gets a good review, it's fine and everything. But if I were to write an article about hijab, let's say, for example, then people get very angry. And so for me then, that kind of inhibits me in writing nonfiction. And I find that if I write fiction, it's kind of more, people find it easier to swallow, let's say. And so because of that, then I also become more free in expressing myself. That's one thing. The other thing is, in terms of writing about actual faith, or let's say anything that is about faith or the supernatural, let's say, it's easier to write that in fiction. A lot more and more articles in the media about Islam, but they tend to be more about Muslims as a minority, or they turn to be in terms of rights. There isn't really much about the actual faith. I mean, whenever people say, even the word faith issues, it doesn't really mean faith issues. It just means religion as an identity or as a group of people. So I find it easier in fiction to actually kind of go deep and to write about what people actually do believe in. Yeah.
That's a very interesting perspective, and I think maybe it harks back to the fact that people trust a fiction writer's voice more, and they trust the world a fiction writer creates more than something a non-fiction writer creates, because people have their own experiences, they have their own opinions to bring to it. The very, very interesting point. I would now like to pass on to Joan and to ask her what liberation means to her.
I found it interesting that you began with thinking about liberation and going backwards to when you were 17, because I think it's not a term that we use very often, this notion of liberation, and particularly in terms of literature. I was born in Grenada, which is a tiny island in the Caribbean, and I've lived in London for more years than I would like to acknowledge just now. But what is important for me is the fact that I am an African Caribbean woman. So I'm almost affronted when somebody says to me, what does liberation mean to you? My response is, hey, I'm an African Caribbean woman. You're asking me what liberation means to me? Because that whole history is, of course, not so far away as we would like to think it might be. Most recently, there's been some debate about reparation, for example, and our beloved Prime Minister memorably suggested that people move on. However, that history is so specific and has been so violent, and it has been so traumatic that resistance for many Caribbean people has become almost part of our DNA, because the world as we know it was never set up for us. It was never, being a writer was never what I was supposed to be. Being a professor in a London university was never what I was supposed to be. I have not arrived in a kind of cocoon, privileged space, and therefore naturally somehow found my way in those positions. So liberation has been very much part of the principle by which I have lived my life, even though I've not called it liberation for a very long time. Once again, going back to maybe the 60s and Black Power days and all of that. But nonetheless, the principle of literature, of writing as liberatory practice is very important to me. We have an odd situation in the UK, I say odd, I could use other words, in which we have at most 80-something, between 80 and 90 black professors within the university system. And I teach literature, which is trying to move out of its national boundaries, that is, English literature. And then people are surprised that black students are not flocking to English literature. I think nobody's begun to think about what kind of literature those children are being offered. So in my university, for example, we have this year, or last year, 2015, we haven't completed the first, we haven't worked through that first year yet. We have the very first master's programme in the world on Black British literature. I find that extraordinary. How could that be? Thank you. So literature as liberatory practice, whether I'm teaching or writing, I'm trying to be a non-fiction writer today, but I'm actually a poet at heart. So I'll stay with that non-fiction for as long as I can. But that it is very much about ideals of liberation that has driven me throughout.
I think that takes us nicely onto Sareeta, who also wants to discuss the role of identity in liberation and what people are expected to write.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd just like to say it's an absolute privilege to be on this panel. I feel like quite the newbie here, so you'll have to forgive me. But yeah, liberation for me, I mean, it's sort of about the idea of permission, who's allowed to write, what you're expected to write as a person of colour. And for me, I think when I started out writing, as Radhika said, I started out writing erotic fiction, and it wasn't something that I thought, do I feel restricted in writing this? Should I be approaching this topic as a young woman of colour? It wasn't something that occurred to me that I shouldn't feel liberated to do that. But I know, I guess upon reflection, when you're asked to sort of think, what does liberation mean to you? You know, liberation, I'm not expressing myself very well, but feeling that you're free to write is, you know, that's an essential part of being a writer and writing truthfully and honestly. So.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. I'll now pass you on to Robin.
I want to kind of respond to everything that everybody's said, and you'll have to shoot me because I talk too much. But I mean, firstly, one person I'll respond to is Leila, but just to try and answer her question, the question that she asked, like, why is it that when she writes a character in a novel who wears a hijab, readers of all backgrounds can appreciate this as a human being, whereas if she writes an article in The Guardian about how she feels about the hijab or some issue of hijab, the politics of the hijab, never read the comments afterwards. I learned that. You'll get 20,000, send them all home and murder them, and they want to rape our women with their hijabs. I think the reason for that is that in politics, in the normal discourse of journalism and so on, people are stuck with their big stories, their pre-existent grand narratives. You know, having just written about Syria and focusing on the Syria issue, this is really blatantly obvious to me that they all arrive with a story about the Sunni-Shia conflict, the ancient Sunni-Shia conflict, or the American-Russian conflict, although America and Russia seem to be actually in agreement with each other, or they've got some big, or imperialism and anti-imperialism, or, you know, they have some big story. It's just like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and they feel that they don't need to pay any attention to the human level. They don't need to listen to Syrians and talk to Syrians about what's happening to them. So I think there's the strength of, and I noticed when we were doing a tour for a book called Syria Speaks, which was a collection of art and writing from revolutionary Syria. I mean, I noticed that the audience response was different from when you do political events, because you were approaching it on a human level. So immediately the people were being asked for an actual kind of emotional and mental engagement with a human being. And unless you're a psychopath, it's very difficult then to come out with these kind of responses that you find in the comments under your article in the Guardian. But anyway, the very basic about what liberation in literature means. Well, to me, the thing that I would most like to be liberated from is death, personally. It's the thing that scares me the most, and it's a kind of living presence. Death is a living presence in every moment of my life. Not just that I am going to die and that the people I love are going to die and so on, but also the problem of time, the way in which we can't hold on to anything. You know, you have a beautiful moment with another human being, and maybe tomorrow that human being will die or leave you, or you know, you see a beautiful sunset and it's already gone. This is the human condition. We're stuck in time, and death and the problem of time are closely connected. So I think that, for me certainly, and I think maybe it's a general rule, that the urge to write, maybe anything, but particularly literary forms, poetry and prose and novels and so on, the urge to write maybe comes from, very originally, it's the idea that you want to try and capture reality. You want to try and hold it down and put it in a cage. You want to liberate yourself from time by trapping time and death, and you know, you want to try and represent the moment and the meaning of the moment and so on. So I think that's where the urge originally comes from. It's the urge to liberate yourself, and you can't do it. Before you start, you failed, but it's an attempt to liberate yourself from time, and also to liberate yourself from perspective and from self. So it is true that an important part of literature, liberation in literature, is the identity stuff, the histories that haven't been told, the stories that haven't been heard. But there's also the aspect where you want to get beyond your own identity as a writer and as a reader. This is the exciting thing, that you can be a white person from Birmingham and you could read one of your poems or one of your novels or your novel, and suddenly you're seeing through the eyes of somebody from a different background who's had a different experience of society and life and the economy or whatever to you have. That's liberating, the ability to go beyond yourself into somebody else's heart and mind for a moment at least. And then there's too much to talk about, but I will finish by talking quickly about Syria again. There's a whole chapter in our very political book about culture, because you really can't separate, when a real revolution is happening, you can't separate politics and society and culture. And what's been happening in Syria, alongside all the jihadists chopping people's heads off and the barrel bombs and the fascism and the imperialism and everything else, alongside all of that horror, there's been this creative bottom-up miracle. Arts in Syria used to be really very, very elitist, in which highbrow art was only for a tiny section of the population. And people felt that they didn't really have a right to, apart from jokes and popular songs, they didn't feel they had a right to kind of enter into this elite world. And that's completely changed in 2011. And there's been an explosion of writing, of graffiti, of hip-hop, of heavy metal, of cartoons and artwork, of music, of all kinds, all forms in Syria. And that's an absolutely fascinating thing. I think it's very sad that the media has informed us so badly of what's happening in Syria. It's stuck to these grand narratives, and it's ignored the ways in which people are liberating themselves on the ground in the most difficult conditions. There are over 400 democratically elected local councils, self-organised local councils in Syria, which almost nobody in the West has even heard of, despite the fact that we supposedly went to war in the Middle East in the last decade to give the Arabs democracy. There they are doing it themselves, making free newspapers, making free radio stations. There's an explosion of popular art bottom up, and we don't see it at all. All we see is ISIS and Assad.
That so many very, very thought-provoking points here. And Robin, I'd just like to pick up on your point about, the narratives being the grand narratives about the wars and not looking at human struggles or things from a micro level. And that brings me to a criticism I've heard once or twice about my own novel that looks, at a moment in history. It's the India-Pakistan partition. I'm an Indian. I'm writing about a Hindu-Muslim couple caught up in what then becomes Pakistan. And I've been asked if I'm looking at this whole period of history very romantically, if I shouldn't be owning the Indian side of the narrative and I shouldn't be looking at it and saying, Pakistan bad, those people bad. But of course, on a human level, and of course that is not, it's never that glib, it's never that easy. But also on a human level, people did live together before the partition. People were neighbors, people were lovers, people were friends. Being two human beings, a family, a village, a city. And to see the effect of catastrophic events that now lie, in our history, and to see how it affected families then and to now. In fact, a lot of people have drawn the link with what is now happening in Syria, because what happened in India and Pakistan nearly 70 years ago unleashed, mass migration to the tune of 16 million people being displaced. And what we're seeing in a lot of the Middle East today is not very dissimilar and is no less heartbreaking. So, in a sense, I think some fiction will look to mine history or mine from history and will, turn a lens to things that are happening today. And I think Robin and Leila and Joan and Sareeta, I'd be very, very interested in your views on that.
Well, I think it's interesting that you were talking about, particularly Leila, about how people relate to, I suppose, essentially, how people relate to the character in a fictional story, but may not necessarily apply those same thoughts and feelings to a non-fiction article, narrative, whatever. And I think it's interesting to also think about representation, because, Robin, you're right, that someone could read a book and not be from the background of that character, whatever, but they can still relate to the story. But I also think it is important, particularly because I write what you might call genre fiction, romantic fiction, for example. You're not necessarily seeing a great deal of representation of people of colour in those stories. And it's thinking about why would that be? Why is it that you don't see people of a certain background in certain stories, or why you don't see people of a certain background writing those stories? So that's something that really interests me. I can't think of that many writers who write, say, romantic fiction who are people of colour. And feeling that you're represented within a story as well as, writing a story that, from a particular perspective, I think that's something that's of interest to me.
So, Sareeta, that's another very, very key point. I think it was Marvin James who said last year that as a writer, you are addressing the white female reader. And I don't know if this is something that is particularly poignant to any of you on the panel, if you feel that there are limits on what you feel you're supposed to write, or if you feel you're stereotyped as writers. If say, I, for instance, I'm going to be looked at as an Asian writer, if you're always going to be looked at as a Muslim writer, or you as an Afro-Caribbean writer, I don't know if you have any perspectives on that.
I wanted to go back to Leila's point about why some people are generally or they appear to be more receptive to something that's fictionalized. And I think it's important to remember that those people who go to that fiction are already in a state of mind to receive that material, unless they're in the classroom, which provides, shall we say, a certain amount of safety around the reception of that. Whereas we're bombarded all of the time. We're being encouraged by a certain kind of journalism all of the time to come up with these instant views, these instant responses, especially to these trouble spots or problems or immigrants or whatever it is. So there is that kind of, yep, we want to read, we want to find out, we want to be able to embrace that is happening. Now, and then the second point about the kind of pigeonholing as a particular kind of writer, there was a stage at which I searched for, say, black women characters in English literature. I searched over centuries. And I happen to know that black folks have been living in Britain since, well, the earliest record I found was something like 1503. So there've been black people here, but I couldn't find them anywhere in the literature. Interestingly, when we come to Afra Ben, I did find a black woman, but she had no voice, which is why I then went on to rewrite the story. Yes, of course, as I said, I understand my history as a writer. There's no expectation that I write. There are immense difficulties still. I also teach creative writing, by the way, and students ask me regularly about agents, for example. I throw my hands up. I say, I can't tell you anything about agents, I'm afraid. Because in that sense, the likelihood of your being represented by an agent is still so minuscule. I say still so minuscule. I mean, the whole writing scene is still, black people are underrepresented within the production of the literature at every level, whether it's writing the words, whether it's publishing, whether it's being any kind of agent within all of it. There is that underrepresentation. Not so long ago, we were told that our words wouldn't sell. I'm always amused by that, kind of wry amusement, because, of course, in a way, that's what Toni Morrison was told. You know, there's no market for this, and then we say, hey, look at Toni Morrison. So it's. I think for some people, there has to be a kind of acceptance that at this moment, this is the situation, but it has to change, and that I think is what we need to be able to see beyond. It has to change, and I think this event today is a signal of the change and the ways in which some people simply have to get hold of the moment and say things have to change.
And Sareeta, do you personally find that you were pigeonholed, that you were expected to write a particular genre?
Well, as I very inarticulately said before, it's something that I didn't think about. I didn't approach, when I sat down to write, I didn't think, am I writing something that I'm allowed to write? It honestly didn't cross my mind. And maybe I'm lucky in that respect, but I don't feel pigeonholed because I think because I didn't feel pigeonholed in and of myself. I didn't think I must write a particular thing because I'm a particular way. To a certain extent, it was important to me to include characters of colour in my book because that's just something I don't see in the type of fiction that I write. So I suppose from that point of view, it's something that occurred to me. But it wasn't that I felt I had to write a particular type of story because of my background. I don't know if that means, I don't know what that signifies, but I do know that it's also important, it's important to me, and I hope it will be important to readers to feel that different types of people of different backgrounds have all sorts of different experiences, and to be able to see that in a range of different types of fiction, I think that's really important. I work in children's publishing as an editor, and as you're saying, Joan, there are just so few people of colour at any level of the publishing industry, and children's fiction is something, you're giving, fiction to young people that you would hope would influence them, as they grow. And to not have a range of representation in that type of fiction, to have it not occur to people to try and make that a reality, I think that's something that obviously needs to change. The number of and the types of narrative as well. I've been told, that, oh, this character can be black because he lives in an inner city, so that makes sense. And that's absolute nonsense. Those are the types of conversations I've had with people. So having a range of representation of different types of narrative, I think that's really key, and that is liberating in and of itself.
Okay, so we've addressed now whether your experiences, whether your ethnicity can stereotype you or limit you. But if you look at it from another perspective, I think experiences and where you come from can also liberate you, can also give you a different perspective to a country you find yourself in. I got into trouble with Robin for suggesting that he, like me, was an immigrant, and he told me no. I'm British, born and bred.
Absolutely, no, I'm not one of those people.
Having said that, he's travelled extensively, as is Leila, as have I, as have you. You weren't born in Britain either. So 4 out of our 5 panelists are migrants in one way or another, and I personally feel that having had the background I have had and having lived in different countries has given me a very, very useful perspective on people in the different countries I've lived in. It's given me an empathy for them, but it's also given me a sense of being an outsider, which I think it's a lens that's very, very useful as a writer. So I'd like to now turn this on to my co-panelists and ask them what their view and their experience has been on migration and literature.
Well, for example, I remember I wrote a character in The Road from Damascus called Marwan, an Iraqi guy who arrives in London with his 2 young children as a refugee migrant. That a lot of that stuff I'd written myself. It was because I'd been living in the Arab world, and 3 years or something would go by, and then I'd come back here for 10 days, and it would be really interesting, especially the first 3 days, because it would feel so foreign. And that's the most interesting thing about travelling, and it's the most interesting thing about being of a diverse background and so on, is the alienation as well as being a difficult thing, and sometimes a kind of like even economically or physically potentially threatening thing. It's a great benefit because it gives you. I don't think you need to be from a diverse background or whatever, because I think it's about the ability to see things freshly and to be estranged, not take things for granted. And I think that we all have the ability to do that. We can all, if we walk down the street with very fresh eyes and try very hard not to rely on our usual assumptions about what we're seeing, we will see things a bit more freshly. We'll notice people's faces and how they're behaving and that's what's behind writing. And certainly you get that very strongly when you are comparing 2 systems or more than 2 ways of seeing, and they're kind of both valid and coexisting at the same time, and yet they are contradictory. And this is fascinating because this liberates us from our own perspectives. So yes, absolutely. I think that having, and then of course in terms of cultural richness, then yeah, I think the interaction and mixture of culture and aspects of culture is a very positive thing, and it produces all kinds of new synthesis. That's human history, even within one culture. I mean, English culture, I suppose, is the result of not just of the influences that have been brought from all the places that English people went, but also of interactions between different regions and different accents and dialects and different points of view and religious groups and so on over the years within England. So difference and diversity is very good for alienating you from, estranging you from your comfort zone in which you think you've got everything understood and you know how everything is, so you don't really need to look carefully.
Yeah, I think it's also, I mean, I agree, but I think it's also important to not to look over our shoulders when we are writing, so that we kind of make this private space, which is just for the fiction. I'm talking about fiction now. And of course it's difficult to do that, but it's important also to do it, because otherwise then a self-consciousness is going to start to creep in through the work. And that's not what you want. I've also deliberately this is something I've done, I don't know if it will work with everyone, but I've never asked a reason for any rejection I've ever gotten. I've never, if I've been turned down by something, I've never asked for a reason, because I just don't want to hear. I don't want to hear that, it's because there's no market for this, or I don't want to hear these things, because they will affect that side of me, that does the writing. So I want feedback from my editor on the text to make it better once I've written it. But once it's the reception of it, and I do read my reviews with interest, of course, but the way it's received, the reason it's been overlooked for that prize, or the reason, this publisher doesn't want to publish it, or whatever, I've never been curious about that. Because I don't want to hear these pat answers, that might start to make me feel pigeonholed, or start to make me feel that, and it's difficult anyway to sit and write fiction, that, I really don't need this kind of, atmosphere.
Or pigeonholed.
I don't even want to know, whether it's been pigeonholed or not. I just need to pretend somehow. It's as if like you're an actor and you need to pretend that the audience aren't there in order to act. Writing is a little bit like that. You have to pretend to somehow that there isn't a reader, so that you can just sort of go into it. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, what is my mom going to think about this? What is so and so going to? It's
particularly pertinent when
I also like your your personal involvement in erotic fiction and being an editor with children's fiction. Do your children's authors know this?
No. But I think the point about perspective and about being aware of or trying not to be aware of your audience is really important in terms of liberation, of course, because if you're writing and thinking, am I allowed to write this? Who's going to be reading this? What are they going to be thinking when they read this? Are they going to be thinking about who's written it and why they've written it? I think that's a difficult line to tread, isn't it? Because obviously you're writing in order for someone to read it, presumably. But by the same token, you don't want to be restricted by that level of awareness, that consciousness of what's being read. But I do also sometimes, I don't know, when I was reading, I probably shouldn't say the name of the book, but a book by a prominent black writer, I actually found myself thinking, what would people who aren't from this background think about this person's opinion? Will they think that this is how all women of colour think about a certain topic? I don't know, I find myself thinking of other people's perspectives. I'm aware of how writing might be perceived by people outside a particular cultural background.
Because this reminds me a lot of thinking I've been doing over the years about Nadim Aslam, who is a certainly, I don't know about all of his books, but Maps for Lost Lovers, I think is actually a very, very, very good novel. It's a very well written novel with some brilliant characterization. I also think that it's profoundly unfair. And here's the issue, like I find myself on the one hand, you know, it's a novel full of British Pakistani Muslim characters, and they are all horrible. You know, they are every single. There's one character who's a Marxist, so he's liberated himself from this background, and he's quite a nice guy. All the others are doing. Every single character is doing an honor killing or beating somebody to death as an exorcism rite, or beating up their wife, or you know, it's. And I asked Nadim about it. I said, like, what, you know, where did you get all these stories? He said, they're all true. I found them all in the Sun. And they probably are. They probably are all true. But there is an issue when you're representing a community that's already so badly misrepresented, and at the same time, so that's half of me feels quite strongly about that. And some years ago, I wrote a review of the book in which I was really actually it was a different book, but I mentioned that, and I was really quite fierce against him. But I've been thinking about it since. And I'm thinking, okay, we have a social problem. The social problem is the poor representations of British Muslims. And then we have a writer who's a human being with his own experiences, and he does what he does. He does what he can do. That's, as writers, we do what we produce, what we are able to produce. And for him, Nadim's own story, he has found his British Muslim background to be very oppressive. And this is what he feels strongly about. He should be fundamentalist, and 5% of them should beat their wives, and 20% should be nice liberal types. But then you can't do that, because once you start trying to ask a writer to do that, you've destroyed his writing. So it's a really difficult area. I think that here we have to, if we're going to put blame, we have to put the blame on the society. Of course, there are distinctions rather than the individual writer. You can't demand. And then me, for example, I am a bit pigeonholed. The Guardian has asked me now by now to review quite a lot of books, but never one which doesn't have something to fiction and non-fiction, a whole range of topics and genres. But what they have in common is every single book involves Muslims or Arabs, and okay, fair enough, but that's the way publishing works. So when you're told that, okay, the average reader in Britain is a middle-class, middle-aged white woman, there's the problem with capitalism. So therefore, literature has to be a machine for producing stuff that's easy for these people in this demographic to read, and that's a great shame. That's how it works. They do. It's not just, you know, people of ethnic minorities and so on. The way that capitalism works, the way that the publishing industry works, it likes to put things into easy little boxes. Oh, if we can hang that on a specific hook, and we can see a marketing strategy for it, we'll publish it. If we can't, we won't. And then when they do publish things, if you look at somebody, who was it? Somebody did a really interesting study. It was Claire Chambers, an academic in the north of England, did a really interesting study of book covers, including some of your books, and Kamila Shamsi's books, and so like books by Muslims, books by Muslim women, books about Muslim women. The same colour schemes, the same 2 or 3 stock images. The veil, the palm tree, the desert, the whatever it is, and it's
liberated now. Look.
Oh, well done, yeah, liberation. So this is the way it works.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask a question on your point about reading being for middle class, middle-aged white women, and someone in publishing actually told me that as well when I was telling them about my book. But why is it assumed that a middle-class, middle-aged white woman wouldn't be interested in Black British identity?
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to
Yes.
say. That's not been my experience of middle-class, middle-aged white women. they're very usually well-educated, well-read, erudite, intelligent, wanting to know more about the world. And so why would the publishers assume, maybe I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this question, why would they assume that the middle-class, middle-aged white woman wouldn't be interested in a book about Black British identity?
Yeah, laziness, I think.
I think that's a very, very good point, isn't it? I think it's because, like and you've mentioned it before, because publishing is full of one particular sort of demographic. So there's a lot of Anglo-Saxon white men and women in all the layers of publishing, which include, say, being an agent, being an editor, being a publicist, and there'll be running bookshops, being a buyer for books. And like it or not, that there are niches they do like to read, so genres they do like to read. So that would include, say, exotic India, but that is a niche. So there is X percentage of literature that they would like to read about, you know, exotic India. And you know, a couple of reviews that I've received have spoken about the aroma of turmeric infuses this beautiful book. And there's not one mention of turmeric in my book. But you know, obviously it's fragrant with turmeric and the smells of Indian spices, etc., etc. So again, there is a bit of stereotyping. There is a bit of, you know, the market responding to the suppliers as well. But I think, you know, slowly it's changing, and I think a lot of that change is beginning with, you know, initiatives like this one today.
Can I just address that question?
Can I just come in? Because I'm Trisha Wombell, I'm from the Black Book Swap. I run a sort of long-running book club in London for Black readers. And I've enjoyed the conversation and to hear your input and the variety of what is a huge subject. But I haven't come here today to hear about what we might call mainstream readers. I think this audience is the other audience. This is the audience that people don't talk about, don't think about the fact that actually we are spending a lot of money on books. We do buy books, we read a wide range of things. And I think I don't want to get, you know, I'm just, you know, white middle class women are some of my greatest and dearest friends, but I haven't come here to hear about what they read and why they read. I want to hear what, you know, we paid good money to be here today, and yeah, I just want to say, just think of us, look at the audience. We're kind of wider and deeper than that, and we're reading, and the whole issues that we don't, you know, it's your point, Sareeta. I wonder why we would want to think about the person who's worried. Why can't we be varied and various? I don't read a book by anyone and worry about the other reader who isn't me. You know, I read a book and think, oh, I want to discuss that with somebody who's like me. I wonder what they think and how they might engage with it. So you know, yeah.
Yeah,
so how am I saying that readers will vary? Let's hear about the reader that's in this room.
well, I agree absolutely, and I agree here your question as well. I mean, I think it's laziness, because I think it's a false assumption. I mean, I think it's just that because you get business people making silly, lazy assumptions and decisions, and they think it's easy for them, that it's worked in the past, that we've sold this kind of book to that kind of demographic, and we've got this kind of you know, financial comeback. And it's very short term, and in publishing these days, from what I understand of it, you generally have the money people, the marketing people are making decisions more than artistic people and so on. But yeah, that's the problem. And then when something is published by a black person or a Muslim or whatever, it's very often, even if you're saying like your book has got nothing to do with turmeric, but it'll have the mango and a pomegranate on the front, and this will be the you know, and then there's like black writing will often be in the black writing section. Now, okay, part of that, we understand why it's a good thing. It's because black writing has been underrepresented, hasn't been published very much, hasn't been heard, it isn't seen, so therefore some people have got together to try to, you know, here is some black writing where you can go and find black writing in this shelf if you want to find it. Great. But on the negative side of that is that anybody who happens to have black skin who writes a book, it could be pastoral poetry, it could be an urban gangster story, It could be a light romance. It could be a work of philosophy, but they'll all be put on the black writings, the black genre shelf. Which
description, isn't it? Because you know we have a lot of views about Amazon, but you know those algorithms mean we can find these books more easily and more wide-ranging. You know they are there and we hunt them out. Social media means we're more connected.
Yes.
And we're sort of finding the authors and sharing the authors.
And there is
we love more, and we've done more variety of the writers, but just to say it's just on the bookshelf is not today, you know.
Well, there's a
That's how Joan gets to
Yeah, and the truth is,
belatedly set up a program where people can come together to study the topic. You know.
and that kind of programming shows that the truth is that people are being restricted in their reading practice by what is available. They're being restricted in universities, they're being restricted in bookshops, they're being restricted by publishers, because the reality is, and I teach in a literature department, therefore I teach mostly white middle class students, females, but those students want a variety of books to read, and some of those students are going to be writers in the real world, in this world where these writers are present, and they need to know that. So yes, we're all being done a grave disservice by what is available and how it's available.
I think it's starting to be the case that people are identifying particular audiences, and people are able to seek things out more readily. Even just if you're like a youngish, I'm 35, but if you're like a young black British woman and you think, I want to find other people who are interested in the same topics that I am, there are now places you can go. There's like Galdem magazine, there's the Jedi, I think has just been set up. I think they might be doing something here. There's Shades of magazine. And that are representing a particular type of thing. If you want to seek something out, that is now possible, and you can feel that there's a place you can go to feel represented. And I think it's just important that in all types of narrative, I know I've said this before, but that it's possible to think that represents me, that's something that I can identify with. And it's not to say that other people can't identify with that as well, but I do think it's important that you can feel this reflects my experience. It doesn't have to always, but the fact that you can find something that might reflect your experience in narrative fiction, that's something that is really important to me.
I think there's been a change in publishing. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, there was the African Writers Series, there was the Women's Press. There were these sort of small publishers who published exclusively, books from, black people from black backgrounds. But then this changed when White Teeth was published and Brick Lane was published, and these became hugely successful. And so then that's what publishers want. They want you to be the next Zadie Smith. They want you to be, this is what they want. And so it becomes then harder for the writers who cannot achieve these sales levels. But then that's the same for all writers, white writers, all writers who cannot achieve these high sales levels. So I think this is the situation that's happening now. Yeah.
That's a good point.
So I just wanted to make a point about what Robin said earlier about Nadim Aslam and his story. I was thinking about exactly the same problem. As an Asian writer, he's written something that is clearly coming from his own experience, but then as Asian people, you're sort of expected to provide the best possible faith because you're representing. But I think actually the actual problem isn't that he's produced this a book that reflects quite badly in some ways to Asian people. It's actually that you haven't got any other perspective at all. Very good perspective, and if you look at the demographic tick boxes everywhere, you can be white, you can be white Irish, etc., etc., etc. But as a person of color, you're either black or Asian or mixed or
so that there's a very, very limited sort of definition of what you are, and I think for better or for worse, well, for worse, there are these extremes that you read about in the press that you see or have seen certainly in British towns and small towns about atrocities committed by a certain strata of society and people from a certain race. But you're right, that's not the sum total of the ethnic experience, the Asian experience, the black experience, the Muslim experience, and it's good that that's coming to the fore now, and people are writing different things.
I mean, again, it's just like we need more stuff published and more stuff read. And Nadim's book wouldn't be a problem if it was part of a large pool of which people were reading, of all kinds of different representations of British Muslims. And I must say again, because we're picking on Nadim a bit, well, I'm not picking on him because I think it's a very good novel. I think it's politically unfair. I think it's a very good novel. And the real strength of it is that his characterization is so good that these characters can be behaving in absolutely appalling ways, but you still feel some human sympathy for them. So there we go. So just to even out, I'm bringing him up because of this difficult issue, but I don't think he's done anything wrong. He's written a story that it's just unfortunate that he's working within a society in which there are big issues of representations of British Muslims and other groups.
Hi, I'm a publishing student, and my lecturers are always talking about how we're such in a state of flux that we can change the industry. Do you not think that maybe liberation in literature is more a case of liberation from the stagnation of the kind of literature that we have been provided? Because I remember that recently the little girl in America who started the campaign 1,000 Black Girls in Books, because she's sick of reading children's literature about white boys and their dogs, and she says the white boys and their dogs are sick of reading it too.
That's a good point.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
My question is for the whole panel, so it's based on something that you said, Robin. You talked about reading as an experience, liberation, in the sense that you can sort of escape your own skin and live with other different people and move borders. I wanted to find out, as writers, how far you can feel that you can transcend your own identities and your own backgrounds and write about characters that maybe you've never lived as, or lived a similar experience to, but still kind of want to explore imaginatively.
Gosh. It's a really difficult question, but I mean, the first thing is that as a writer and an individual, I kind of claim the right to write anything I want and to write any kind of character I want. Once I start doing this kind of thing, I mean, if I start worrying about, am I really qualified to write in that voice, then I stop being a writer, because the only person I'm actually qualified to speak in the voice of is me. Born where and when I was to my parents and my specific experiences. I don't represent Arabs, I don't represent British Arabs, I don't represent British people, I don't represent men, But of course I write female characters. I'm working on a novel at the moment, which is also set in Syria. I hope it's going to be the last one which deals with Arabs and Muslims. But in which, there's lots and lots of different characters. Of course it's an issue, because there was John Updike, who is a novelist who I admire very much. I admired his Rabbit trilogy very, very much, and it was a big influence on me at one point. And he wrote a book called Terrorist about an Egyptian-American young man who becomes a terrorist. Now, all right, John Updike is a creative writer. He has the right to write anything he likes from anybody's perspective, and people have the right to say when they think he's got it very wrong, and he's got a right to do it. I think he wasn't able to transcend his own assumptions when he was writing that character, because it's just racist and silly and totally unrealistic, and it's just absurd on so many levels. this character, it hasn't worked, and I think that's a literary failure. It's not because he's tried to write as somebody or write about somebody from a different background to him, it's because he's failed in literary terms. I think Bruce Chatwin wrote that book about set in a African, what was it called? The Viceroy of Ouija or something? Which is a very weird book again, but I mean, it's a very interesting one. He'd never been, he creates this picture of an Africa, of a historic Africa, which feels so very real, but I'm sure isn't.
That's the point, isn't it? If you can create a character that feels real, that feels truthful, and that whoever's reading it believes in, then that's really all you have to try and focus on as a writer. I mean, obviously you can't completely ignore that a character's background will affect, you know, their behaviour or how they relate to the world. But I think as long as I wouldn't approach a character thinking, am I allowed to write in this person's voice or whatever, I would, you know, as long as it comes across to me and to the reader as real and true, I think that's all you need to...
But it is harder to write about someone who
Absolutely,
comes from a different
yeah.
background. I'm
I mean,
currently
quite
trying to do this. I'm trying to write about an Anglo-Saxon woman who grew up in the 70s, and I don't have the cultural references to do with her childhood. I just don't. I can write about, even though I've spent 6 years in India, no more, I can write about people of roughly my generation and a generation older, even if they're from North India like I am, or equally if they're from South India. That seems accessible to me. But writing about this woman who I feel very, very passionately about, and I really want to tell her story, I don't have access to the vernacular of her childhood. So hopefully it's something I do end up writing, and I want to do it as a challenge, and hopefully it reads as true to readers. But it's definitely a worthwhile pursuit, but it's
more of a challenge, then.
Much more of a challenge, yes.
And I think I wanted to just engage with that idea in terms of being someone who teaches creative writing, because for a long time, clearly part of the reason there is, it's a complicated set of reasons why there's an absence of black characters in English literature. But part of the reason, in a way, is that people didn't feel they didn't feel they were worth writing about. That's one thing. Another is that they didn't feel that they could get under their skin and write about them. And to a large extent, as long as we have lots of universities now teaching creative writing, but as long as we have a situation in which people are nervous because they don't know they don't know this other world that they may be trying to draw people in from or represent, as long as they're nervous, they don't give themselves permission to do the exploring. And one of the things that I do, I am very nervous of it myself, but one of the things I try to do is to give my students permission to explore other voices, because they often think they can only write in standard English, even though they may have many other rich voices that they could use. They also think that they can only write very narrowly about the world they know. On the one hand, we have people saying, you must write what you know. On the other hand, the actual world that these young people live in now are globally so much richer. They live, the person who lives underneath them, whose feet they hear come in at 9 o'clock every evening, they hear the shoes drop, they hear the door click, they hear the fridge door open, that person upstairs is not necessarily someone who looks like them, who's come from another world, who's come from the same world that they inhabit. So it's part of their repertoire to be sensitive, to a lot more sensitive than earlier writers. I have to say, I've not done it much myself, though I'm open to thinking about it. I admire, in that respect, Zadie Smith for the ways in which she has tackled it. And I think in NW, for example, she does that really well. You have a sense that this is the contemporary global present, but the writers coming up now have to. They really must have that sense. Even if they choose, they make the choices about what they do, they need to be much more aware of this world.
In my latest novel, I wrote about the 19th, one of the main characters is a 19th century Georgian princess. So this was, of course, very, very far from my own experience in that she's a Christian, she's in the 19th century, she's Georgian, you know, it's very, I've never been to Russia.
But you are a princess.
And I'm a princess. But so I thought, well, how do I connect with her? And I thought the thing we have in common is motherhood. So I kind of approached her in that angle, and that's how I kind of connected with the character. Of course, it helps that it's set in the past, and no one now is going to say to me, "Oh, you got it wrong." In the same, I mean, it would be more difficult now in the situation you're describing, where you're actually writing about someone who's around you now, and then they'll say, "Oh, you got it, you got it wrong," or like that. But I think that maybe from a creative writing point of view, one of the ways is then to find a connection, find something that you have in common with this character.
Well, can I just add one thing? And that's about getting it wrong. Mm-hmm. If it's done well and it's wrong, what you do is create opportunities for other people to write back.
Okay.
Yeah. And we have Jane Eyre and the Mad Woman in the Attic and all that writing back. We have Orinoco and we have Imoinda and so on. So it kind of leaves space as long as it's done well enough in the first place.
Hi, my name is Cortina Butler. I work for the British Council. I just wanted to make a point about white middle-aged women readers. Before I wanted to something else, just because the reason why publishers focus on middle-aged women readers of whatever colour is that they are the people that read. Generally speaking, men don't read fiction, as a huge generalisation. Women read fiction. It's that block of women of all colours who read, and that is why publishers tend to focus on books that they think, correctly or incorrectly, that group of people will be interested in. But I wanted to quote, and it is slightly picking up again on what Robin said. I heard Salman Rushdie making a very powerful plea for more imagination in writing. He feels that particularly creative writing, the huge sort of increasing creative writing classes, and a feeling that what people should write about is what they know about, is actually leading to a rather narrow sort of definition of what writing should be. And picking up that and picking up what Robin was saying is, do you feel constrained, I mean thinking about the liberation topic, do you feel constrained by the requirement to write about what you know, and also more to be a good representative, or to represent the culture that you come from in a positive way? Because I was quite shocked about that comment about Nadim Aslam's book. I think he should be able to write about horrible people if he wants to. There are many, many books written by white writers where all the characters are unpleasant, and I don't think there should be any difference for people who are writing from a culture that is a different culture. And I know that I've misunderstood, but do you feel constrained by the requirement, both internally and externally, in the cultures that you come from, to give a positive message about the cultures that you come from? And do you feel that there needs to be more of a liberation, that actually writers of colour should feel able to write about anything that they want to?
You know Irvine Welsh, is he called Irvine Welsh, the Scottish writer?
Yeah.
So Irvine Welsh's books are very Scottish, and in their language and in their setting and so on. And his characters tend to be drug addicts, rapists, football hooligans. A baby gets killed with a heroin needle in its arm in one kind of thing. So you could say, well, if you read Irvine Welsh, you get the impression that, that Scotland is all about drug addiction and rape and killing children. The thing is, what we're talking about is the social context, because this is one, when we read Irvine Welsh, we automatically understand, here's this guy with his hard-bitten, cynical approach, and he's writing about this aspect of life in Scotland. We don't think that's what Scotland is all about, because we've got a million other references, cultural references, and a million other things on TV and in the newspapers and so on about Scotland, which have got much more positive, talk about much more positive sides. So there's the issue. To reiterate what I said earlier about Nadim, I agree with you. I don't think that the problem, I think that there is an issue in a book like Maps for Lost Lovers, a serious issue. If you're reading that as a British Muslim, and you're putting that next to the Daily Express and the Daily Mail and the Sun, and also the Guardian and the Times and the Telegraph every day, and what comes on TV, it feels a bit scary. It feels a bit, and I'm not a British Pakistani, it's specifically about British Pakistanis. There is an issue of representation, because people's heads, if you read the comments underneath Leila's article about hijab in the Guardian, these very, very mainstream ideas that all of these people are barbarians and their culture is barbaric. And one or two of them manage to escape their culture and they're okay. But basically, it's a huge problem for us, it's a secure, etc., etc. It's the context that I'm talking about. I agree with you, absolutely, Nadim Aslam should have the right, just like Irvine Welsh. Just because he has brown skin, it doesn't mean that he has to be good and write good characters about good people from his community to show the white people that some of us are nice. No, of course not. Of course not. He should be free to write, but there is an issue which doesn't exist with the Irvine Welsh thing. It's to do with the social context, the political context.
To do with the quantity of narratives.
And the quantity of narratives.
I mean, that's really
Yeah. But I didn't answer your other question, someone else can.
I think personally as a writer, I don't feel at all compelled to portray a certain view of India or of Indians, and all Indians have to be good or heroes. When I'm writing, I feel like I have to tell the truth, and the truth may not always be good, it may not always be beautiful, but that is what I feel compelled to do. So there's a lady here.
Thanks. I think what you used a very important word much earlier in this conversation, and it was partly relating to the point that Leila opened with about the difference between fiction and non-fiction, and that's about empathy. And when you're not talking about huge issues and some big cultural narratives, but you're talking about creating an empathy between the reader and the writer, wherever that reader's coming from and whatever that reader's background, that I think is the most successful and the most important thing. And I mean, I pick up your book because I go to the library all the time and get through a phenomenal amount of stuff, so I'll take a risk with anything. I don't read a particular genre. If it looks interesting, I'll read it, I'll give it a chance. And if I have an empathy, it doesn't matter where the characters are set or my background. I mean, I am one of those middle-class women who reads a lot, and it's a risk I'm prepared to take. That's my liberation, I suppose. But I think we haven't really talked about empathy very much. I think it is one of the most important things that makes society work, actually.
It is, and when you talk about liberation, I think, readers' liberation is key as well. And as far back as I can remember, I remember being in my bedroom, supposed to be asleep, and reading about characters in Toni Morrison novels, which again is very, very different to my experience, or people in Victorian or pre-Victorian England. Again, very, very different from my experience. But that was very, very liberating to be in those people's shoes and to understand what they felt, how they smelled, how they lived. So yes, yeah.
But I do think it's important to have a narrative that, you're right, that anyone can empathise with any character in any book, but it is important to have some readers feel maybe taken by surprise that they empathise with a character that is not of their same background. But they won't be able to do that if they don't have those characters represented in a variety of books.
I just wanted to address the point about universities. They keep coming up here. Having been through a creative writing MA, I would say that write what you know, I think, only applies to white middle-class men. Because you actually, the stories that that are thrown down at you as the models to write are all written by white, middle-class, educated men. And actually, as an author, when you're trying to put your work across, you get, or certainly as a minority author, when you're trying to put your work in a workshop environment, etc., you keep being told, but is this authentic? Do you feel this is authentic? I don't get the feeling that this character would do such a thing.
Maybe a bit more turmeric, right?
Possibly, more spice. But unfortunately not too much spice either, because
that alienates readers.
too many non-English words will throw your audience completely. And I even had a comment where in one of my stories there were a few non-English words, and I was told I stopped reading after the second paragraph because there were so many non-English words, I just couldn't bother to, I felt alienated, which was an interesting comment, but I just wanted to throw that perspective in here as well.
I think language in writing is very, very, very important. You have writers like Samuel Beckett and now Jhumpa who have left their native languages and begun to write in another language that they feel that they don't have any sort of native access to. So the fluidity of accessing another language introduces you to another experience, and I think the ability to access, in my case, Hindi words, sprinkled through parts of the text makes it more real. And the fact that they aren't always translated into English, I think makes the interaction with the reader, I think, all the more powerful, because the reader then has to really exercise their imagination and themselves to place themselves into that particular part of India, or that particular part of Pakistan, or that particular part of Britain where you know the action is taking place. So I'm all in favour with what you spoke about.
I'll just respond very briefly. I was highly amused at that description of creative writing teaching, and I'm not going to apologise at all for creative writing teaching, because I'm the diversity in the space of creative writing where I work. So I think it's, again, mercifully, it is changing slowly, and people are beginning to realise. Partly I was laughing because I had a conversation with a colleague. We were talking just about that, and he said, well, you know, I was brought up in East Anglia. Did I ever speak to a black person before I came to London? So it's tough, but it's changing very slowly, and it's changing faster for us having events like this, I think. It means that our teachers and our publishers are have to sit up a little bit more and notice.
I think if you're faced with a question like, is this authentic? Then if the person needs to ask you that question, you can happily ignore their opinion.
I agree. I just think the fact that question actually even exists is an interesting aspect of it.
My students come and find me quietly and they say, this is what he said. But they're not my students. I'm okay. The word has got out.
Unfortunately, you weren't around.
No.
And some of the writers that I work with, I feel that the only way that they can get into publishing, aside from self-publishing, is to write either the exotic or to write racially neutral characters in their work. What advice would you give them about that?
I think you should just write what you want to write. I don't think that you should worry about getting published before you write. I think you should just write first, you know, just get it out. And you should be, dying to get these words out. Nothing should be stopping you. You know, when you're really on a roll, you should be just like, you know, wanting to write. And then after that, it's a struggle to find an agent, it's a struggle to find a publisher, but that's the same for all writers starting out, whatever their background, you know, it's also hard to start out. And because things like that can be like this can be very oppressive to think that way. Really, really, it can really very, even if it's true that this is the reason the novel got rejected, it's better to pretend that it's not true. It's better to kid yourself that it's not true, because you have to keep your integrity as a writer and to keep writing. So I mean,
but if I know as a writer that if I publish 2 exotic books, and then after that I can write whatever I want.
but how do you know? How do you know?
So there are a few authors that, Valerie Blackman, for example, one of the first things she wrote was a racially neutral novel, and she wouldn't have got it published unless it was, racially neutral, which kind of we read as white, universally. What would you say, And then after that, she kind of went on to publish other stuff, which was about race.
But I think you can't think in those terms, otherwise you'll never be able to pursue what you genuinely want to write. I don't think you can try and have a strategy. I doubt Mallory Blackman had a strategy, or perhaps she did, I don't know, but I doubt she went into it thinking, okay, this is going to be my plan, I'll write a racially neutral book and then I'll be free. I think you just have to, as Leila says, try and write the thing you genuinely want to write. I mean, I work in publishing, and obviously I'm an author as well, and part of me can feel jaded that it's not necessarily going to be a money spinner. It's not going to be if you're thinking this is going to be my career and therefore I need to plan how I'm going to go about it, perhaps that's the wrong way to think of it. I think if you just have to try and focus on what do I really want to write, and you have to try and have that belief that somebody somewhere is going to think this is exactly what I want to publish, this is exactly what I want to read, rather than trying to second guess the process. I mean, I think it's really admirable that you don't hear the rejection for a book, and I think that's a great way to approach these things. I mean, look at your achievements. I just think you have to try not to worry about who's looking at your book, who's judging you, you have to just pursue what you think is authentic.
And I completely agree with Leila. If for many of us who must write, if we actually do not write, we practically feel ill. If we don't get that stuff out, we know that we're going to die in some way. And I don't think imagining that somebody will receive it if it's watered down is going to help with that feeling. There's that immediate feeling that I have to do this, I can't do anything else until I've done this. So I would say, write what you need to. That thing that is dying to come out or is threatening to kill you, you had better write it. Yeah.
It's not a career. It really is. It really isn't a career. I mean, mate, there are of course, I don't know, 1 or 2 writers who make lots of money writing. I don't suppose they approached it as a career in the first place. But it's not a career. It's not going to, if you're going to, and ultimately it's really hard because writing is an act of communication. You do want to be heard. It's like, it's a soul-destroying thing if you spend like years on some great work and nobody wants to read it. And like, I'm just talking to myself in a room, I'm just, of course it's an act of communication, but at the end of the day you can only write what you can write. Otherwise there's no point doing it. You may as well just do something else.
Robin, I think that's led to a very pertinent point, that the ultimate liberation then is in your writing process and being true to yourself. And I hear now we're completely out of time. We've run over. But thank you so much to this panel. Thank you so much for this lovely engaged audience, for I think some very, very interesting discussions about the whole topic of liberation as writers, as readers, as immigrants, as indigenous people, as people who are stereotyped, and essentially as people who must write and people who feel that they have a need to read different voices and voices that speak to them. Thank you.